Death, snakes, and public speaking. What do these three have in common? For many Americans, those are the top three fears. But for some cases, the fear of public speaking actually trumps the fear of death. This is why we're trying to get you enculturated into the lab and become comfortable. This week we're going to start by understanding what differentiates public speaking from other forms of communication. And then next week we'll go into more of a historical context about the art of rhetoric. So let's begin by understanding what public speaking is and the considerations we need to take into account as we begin to understand the context of ourselves as speakers and the audience. So what is public speaking? Truly, it's the art of rhetoric, and that is the art of speaking well. In a historical context, public speaking was an avenue for conveying thoughts, whether they were to inform or persuade an audience, and was considered an art form of civic duty. So let's look at the three purposes of public speaking. The first purpose is to inform. Many of you, depending on what your intended career is going to be, you're going to have the opportunity to inform audiences, possibly about a topic or a product. And so when we look at informing, those are typical presentations that you would give. And the point of that is to extend common knowledge for your audience and to identify with the audience and their needs. Why do they need to know this information? The second type of public speaking purpose is to persuade. This is a political time in our country right now as we prepare to get ready for the next elections. And so we're going to see people try and persuade the audience, their ideas, their values, and why they are the correct candidate. So persuasion is another purpose. And then finally, the third purpose is to entertain. And we see this many times on television, right? They're trying to entertain, to tap into what the audience thinks is funny. And so to inform, to persuade, and to entertain. And really we're going to take that entertainment not necessarily as learning how to do stand-up comedy, but how to also bring some humor into possible topics of informative or persuasive speeches. Now, let's look at communication. The word communication actually begins, the etymology of the word is from the word communicare in Latin, and it means to share or to put in common. That is the purpose of any public speaker, to realize how to take their ideas and their information and to share that with the audience. But they also have to figure out how to identify with the audience, to put those ideas in common with their audience, with their needs and interests. But let's look at early models of communication. What we have to realize is that communication is not linear. In other words, typically the person who is sending the message, it's not just as straightforward as their message goes to a receiver and the receiver always understands the message. There are many different factors that create barriers into effective message reception. And so communication is not one way or linear or simplistic. One of the very first models of communication was Berlow's model of communication in the 1960s. And what Berlow said was, you know what, let's look at some factors in communication. And so he looked at the four areas: the sender, him or herself; the message, what is the content of the message; the channel; and the receiver. So let's begin with the sender. You are a sender of a message. What do we have to take into consideration as we understand the sender? Their communication skills. What level are your communication skills? The attitude. Even if you're an audience member, you have to think about the attitude of the sender of the message that you are receiving. So it's their communication skills, the attitudes that they may have, or their values, their knowledge, their social system, where do they come from, or culture, because that affects how they communicate and the words that they choose or their communication linguistic style. It's also how they're going to choose to tap into the audience's needs. So we look at the sender. Next we look at the message itself. What is the context of that message? What is the situation surrounding the message? The words that are used, the elements, the treatment, the structure, and the codes of the message. In today's society, when we have such a very diverse culture, we have to take into consideration how people choose to structure messages. Maybe English is a second language, and so their structure and word tense may be different than ours as well. But that can also come from the sender's attitudes, or back to their cultural social system. So the message, the words that we used, and how we frame that. Third is the channel. Now, there are many different channels for communication. What we have to realize is that face-to-face communication in a public speaking setting is the richest form of communication. Why is that? Because as a channel, face-to-face, you're not only listening to my words or reading them in a very flat context like texting a message or emailing, but in face-to-face, you can hear how I sound, my tone, my pitch, my volume, my rate of speech, as well as visually take in my nonverbal communication. And so that message becomes very rich. Face-to-face is a rich channel. Emails or texts are very flat channels. How many times have you gotten a text and wondered what it meant? You can't read between the lines. The sender may have meant something completely different than what you get as the receiver, depending on the channel that was chosen. LOL does not cover a multitude of sins. So we have to think about the channel. In public speaking, it is going to be rich because not only do you convey the message, the words, but how you convey those words is going to impact the audience, their interest, and how you sway possible opinions and values. So in that channel, in public speaking, we hear, we see, we can almost touch. Maybe there's a visual aid. Maybe the speaker reaches out to the audience somehow and interacts. And then that feeling that is created through that channel. And then finally, the receiver. Now, I, as a sender, have to take into consideration my communication skills, my education level, my social background, and then I have to look at who I'm talking to. Who is my audience? What is their communication level, their attitudes? What is their knowledge about the topic? If you're an engineering student and you're speaking to a group of education majors or kinesiology majors, then you're going to have to think about how you explain an engineering topic. Much more so than you would with other engineering majors. Same thing with any type of major, you have an intrinsic knowledge that your receivers may not have. So taking that into consideration is going to help how you create that message effectively. Now, one of the things that Berlo did not do in this model, and this is the sender, message, channel, and receiver model, but what he didn't take into consideration were a couple of other factors. The first one is audience feedback. Even though you are a public speaker and you're here, now in this setting, this is mediated communication. This is mediated communication. So this is really one way. I am not getting any feedback from you. You are on the other side of a computer screen. I can't see how you're sitting or reacting or listening. But in a public speaking context, as a speaker, I am looking at my audience, and so I can read their feedback. Are they texting messages? Are they smiling, making eye contact with me, nodding? That's feedback. I'm going to adjust how I react or connect with my audience based on the feedback, that nonverbal that I'm getting. Or if I ask a question, do they understand or not? That may adjust how I present the message. So audience feedback. The second is noise. There are two different types of noise that we have to think about as a speaker for our audience and ourselves. The first one is internal noise. In other words, our brains work at 8 times the speed with which anyone can speak. The average speaker speaks 175 words a minute in English. And so the U.S. speaker speaking 175 words a minute if they're a quick speaker, then my audience, their brain is working 8 times that speed. That's why when you're sitting in a lecture or someone's talking to you, you're thinking, you've got internal noise. Where am I going to go to lunch? What all do I have to do today? Do I like this person or not? What do they have on? It may not be that you're thinking about the message. So noise is a barrier to message reception. So you have internal noise, physiological noise. You're sitting in lecture, it's early in the morning, you didn't eat breakfast. You're thinking about, oh my gosh, is my stomach growling or do I have a headache? So noise is a factor to take into consideration internally, but then you have external noise, which is why we will always ask you to turn off your cell phones. because we don't want the cell phone going off and distracting the audience. But it might even be people walking by in the hall, or the air conditioning unit turning on and creating some kind of distraction for the audience. So Berlo didn't take this into consideration either. Audience feedback, noise, and then that language is symbolic. Just because you know what you mean by a word does not mean that your audience automatically receives it in that intended way. So if I were to say the word flight to you, F-L-I-G-H-T, what am I talking about? It could be a flight of stairs, a flight of birds, a flight that I need to go on next Friday out of Atlanta to Miami. A mass exodus is a flight. So language is symbolic, and we need to understand our audience, like Berlo said, their background, their socioeconomic, their education level, the context of the message, to use the word choice correctly to connect and make sure that we have shared meaning with our audience. So these were the other considerations that Berlo didn't take into consideration when he was looking at all of the barriers in communication. Now, let's look at the types. Obviously, we have interpersonal. You're talking to your roommate about your weekend, your plans. That's interpersonal. Typically, we don't have a lot of anxiety over interpersonal communication. We can regulate how we feel about that and how we choose to engage. Intrapersonal is that inner dialogue. Here's an example. You're going to pick up the phone and call your mother to ask for money, or your father, to ask for money for books. The inner dialogue may be, before they pick up the phone, how am I going to phrase this? Am I telling them that I've gotten to the bookstore early and looked for used books, or that I've gone on Amazon and am renting the books, that I'm trying to save them money? Maybe I need to call my parents to ask for something outside of the norm. You have that inner dialogue going on that regulates how you choose to communicate. Then we have group communication. Group communication is the meetings that you're in, classes, and that's where there's shared responsibility, right? Because you feel like other people are going to pitch in to communicate and to regulate the conversation. It's not solely your responsibility. Then we have mass communication. For our TCF majors, they understand very readily mass communication. It's mediated, and we can look at radio, internet, television, but you're broadcasting a message. You don't have that feedback or interplay from your audience. So mass communication is different, once again, in the channel that we choose to use. Then finally we have public communication, or public speaking. And public speaking has 4 things that make it unique from the rest of the communication avenues. So, first of all, it's more formal. In that interpersonal communication, you choose to use slang, to use a common language possibly that you have with a sorority sister or fraternity brother. You've got some narrative that you can pull from, right? You are not presenting yourself in as much of a professional way. The language that you choose is less formal. So in public speaking, it is more formalized because you are solely responsible for this message. Even though you've got feedback from your audience, we are looking at that public speaker to have prepared their message and to deliver it with confidence and to deliver it in a way that is receivable to our audience. Secondly, we have signposting. Now, signposting is quite interesting in that maybe you've heard the old axiom, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. This is what we want you to do in public speaking. It's much easier to give a preview, to tell the audience up front, I am planning to inform you on this topic, and here are my 3 main points that I'm going to cover today. As you cover those main points, first, this is my first main point. You explain it. Then you move on to, now that we've covered this, we're moving to the second point. In a persuasive speech, it is, this is how I plan to persuade you today on this topic. This is why it's important to you. First, I'm going to look at the problems, second, the causes, and finally, some solutions. Along the way, you're going to let the audience know where you are in the speech by including signposts. Third, we look at sourcing. We know that you may have credible experiences within that topic. Maybe you are an experienced gymnast and you want to talk about something that has to do with gymnastics. Well, that you are a source. But we also want you to bring in current, credible, and objective resources from research, because we want to know that something is timely, that you are not just telling us your opinions, but facts. And you want to make that topic relevant and interesting to your audience. So in public speaking, we want to hear your sources. So according to the New York Times on February 11th, 2015, so-and-so stated that. You're going to orally cite your sources in your speeches so that we realize that you are a credible source of information. And then finally, once again, it is the responsibility of that one individual, which is why we want you to prepare and practice. We're going to give you all the tools that we can to equip you with each speech along the way. We have resources not only in our lab instructor lab hours, but I'm here as a resource as well as the speaking studio, which your lab instructors will share with you. You can make appointments and come in and practice speeches as well as get help with your outlines. So this is what we're looking at as far as communication and realizing how public speaking differentiates from other forms and the factors that we need to take into consideration. Now, back to the beginning. Death, snakes, and public speaking. Death is inevitable, although we want to get as much joy from this life as humanly possible and make a difference. Snakes are largely avoidable if you're paying attention. But public speaking, while it may be one of the largest fears for Americans, public speaking is an opportunity, and we want to equip you with the skills to make the most of that opportunity as they present themselves throughout your life. Thank you.